So welcome, friends. I'm Father John Deere, and welcome to this Beatitudes Center Zoom session with our very special guest today, Dr. Jim Finley, coming to us from Los Angeles. Before we begin, let me ask everyone again to mute yourselves and to keep yourselves muted. That'll help with the recording. And as we prepare for the conversation after Jim's presentation, I ask you to write any questions or comments in the chat. And please feel free to ask Jim a question. Be great. He's going to speak for about 45 minutes. Then we're going to open it up for questions for Jim for about 45 minutes. And in a few days, we will send you the Zoom recording link if you want to listen again. Well, since we have this great special guest who's going to be talking with us on the mystical foundations of nonviolence. So we're going to be talking about mysticism, mystical universal love, and its connection with total nonviolence. I invite us to see this really as a time of prayer, or even if you want to do more, to make this a little retreat day for yourself about this. Maybe to spend some time in meditation after the session and to journal about it so that you can explore Jim's wisdom in your own heart and your own life and deepen in mystical love and nonviolence. So I'd like to begin with a little prayer, and then I'll introduce Jim. So I'm going to invite you to take a moment of silence and to enter into the presence of the God of peace who loves each one of you infinitely. And let's welcome the nonviolent Jesus here into our circle. And in a moment of silence, let's ask for whatever graces of peace and love and nonviolence we need for ourselves and for our poor world. Beloved God of peace, thank you for all the blessings of life and love and peace that you give us. Be with us now and bless us abundantly as we reflect with our friend Jim Finley and on your call to go deeper into your mystical universal love, your way of total nonviolence. So bless us that we might practice and spread your teachings of love and nonviolence, that we might be your holy people of universal love and universal nonviolence, your beatitude people, your beloved sons and daughters, your holy peacemakers. We ask this mighty blessing in the name of the nonviolent Jesus. Amen. So these are such difficult times with the evil war on Ukraine, and there's all the wars going on the terrible shootings and killings in the last few weeks, most notably in the Buffalo supermarket, on the elementary school in Uvalde, Texas. Meanwhile, the ongoing racism and poverty and greed and executions and nuclear weapons preparation, environmental destruction. So what I'm trying to do here at the Beatitude Center is to help all of us follow the nonviolent Jesus and to understand and practice and promote his Sermon on the Mount teachings of universal love and total nonviolence. That's what I call it. So that's why, to me, this is such a great blessing for me, the Beatitude Center, and for all of us this morning, all those who are listening, to welcome and introduce my friend Jim Finley to you. I consider him one of the nation's and the world's leading teachers on Christian mysticism, who's going to talk with us on his title, The Mystical Foundations of Nonviolence, so about Christian mysticism and its connection with gospel nonviolence. Jim Finley is a clinical psychologist coming to us from Santa Monica, California, a scholar on meditation and mysticism. Jim, long ago, was a Trappist monk at the Abbey of Gethsemani in the 1960s, where Thomas Merton was his novice master and spiritual director. He's an author of a number of books, including Christian Meditation, Experiencing the Presence of God, The Contemplative Heart, and Merton's Palace of Nowhere, which many people consider the best book ever written about Thomas Merton. He leads retreats and workshops throughout North America and is currently on the staff, the faculty of the Center for Action and Contemplation, where he teaches with our friend Father Richard Rohr and hosts the CAC podcast, Turning Toward the Mystics. Dear friends, give a big round of applause with a lot of waving and show of hands to welcome the one and only Jim Finley. Welcome, Jim. The floor is yours.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much for that. And I'm so pleased we're able to do this. You know, as you were saying earlier, this is a new territory for me, first time. A couple of years ago, I started working on mystical sobriety, which we're going to release as a course this year, the mystical dimensions of each step of recovery. So I think that's what got me going. I would take the same approach. If you have mystical sobriety, we can have mystical nonviolence. And so what would be a meditation on it? So I've been sitting with it for a few days, and these are some sharings, my initial attempts to explore this together. And I want to say too, echoing what you said, I'm offering this as a kind of a, not the topic of mystical nonviolence, but the explorations of mystical nonviolence as a way to pray. That is a kind of a parable that kind of bears witness to the mystery of mystical nonviolence in our lives. So I'd like to begin then with some sources of where I learned some of the things I'll be sharing with you. And the first source I want to share, I'm going to share two, is that after I left the monastery, I started leading silent contemplative retreats around the United States and Canada. And I used to wonder, like, what is it that would bring these people to these retreats? There'd be maybe 50 to 100 people there, depending on the size of the retreat house. And I sensed that what it was that they had heard the retreat was going to be in silence, that the meals are going to be in silence, and all are going to be encouraged to be silent throughout the weekend, that there are going to be periods of shared silent meditation and prayer before each conference and at the end of the day. And that in the conference, I would be drawing up on the teachings of a mystic and applying their insights into God's presence in our life to our own daily life in the world. And therefore, I think they came because they were drawn toward that. They kind of sensed they wanted to have an opportunity to go deeper into this intimacy with God. And so I want to share a story, one of the stories that someone shared when I very first started giving the retreats. I think this was San Damiano Retreat House in California, Northern California. This was years ago, 1980, maybe 81. There was a man on the retreat. He was an elderly gentleman, about the age I am now, actually, 40 years later, and very formal person. He wore a suit and tie for the whole retreat, and he took the silence so seriously, he wouldn't even speak to me. And at the end of the retreat, he gave me a note, handwritten note, which over the years I've kept in my Bible here. So this was his note to me. He says, I went to my spiritual director and told him I was having difficulty in my spiritual life. And my director said, meditate 15 minutes a day. He said, I told my director, reminded my director that I was head of a large corporation and I didn't have 15 minutes a day. And my director said, that's great, take 30 minutes a day. And then he said, that was 30 years ago, he told me that. 30 years, question mark, 30 minutes, question mark, Deo gratias, he says to me. I was moved by that. And so I think really the mystical dimensions of our longings sometimes begins in the grace of the awareness that something's missing. See, something's missing. There's the awareness that in the momentum of the day's demands, we're being swept along skimming over the surface of the depths of our own life. That we're suffering from depth deprivation is the problem. And what's regrettable about it all the more is that God's oneness with us is hidden in the depths over which we're skimming. And so the gift of this longing that then sets in motion the desire, how do I consummate the longing? Like St. Augustine, you made our hearts for thee, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, which is the path. Which is the path. There's another way that it begins, not with something's missing, but it begins with a touch of mystical oneness in the midst of our daily life. An example I often use for this is in Thomas Merton's, the last chapter of his classic work, New Seeds of Contemplation. And he begins by saying in this text, he says, the world and time are the dance of the Lord in emptiness. The silence of the spheres is the music of a wedding feast. That is, he's bearing witness to the spiritual worldview of contemplative Christianity, that from all eternity, God's let there be light. He's speaking light into being. Let there be stones and trees and stars. In a self-donating act, God is pouring out the infinite actuality of herself and manifesting itself as the world. So that the world is God's body, that it bodies forth the love that's uttering it into being. Then having affirmed then, or bearing witness, that life, just the immediacy of life is sacred and holy and ultimately divine, and its nothingness without God. Because if God would cease loving the world into existence at the count of three, the world would disappear. Because the world is nothing, absolutely nothing, apart from the infinite love of God uttering the world into existence as the infinite reality of God is the reality of the world in its nothingness without God. And then Merton says this. He says, we do not have to go very far to catch echoes of that game and of that dancing. So there is this divinity of the immediacy of all things. The sound of rain, the sun moving across the sky, the breeze against our face, the smell of a rose, everything. And then there are moments we're graced with the awareness of it. And the examples that he gives, I'll paraphrase them. One, they come in the midst of nature. He talks about walking alone out in the midst of nature. And he said, you turn to see a flock of birds descending. And as if out of the corner of your eye, you catch something in their descent that's primordial, vast, and true. He says, well, when we know love in our own hearts, sometimes two people in deep, committed, intimate relationship with each other, in a moment of deep donating themselves to each other in union, they get the sense that God's the infinity of their union. And their union is the intimate immediacy of God. You look down into a child's upturned face, and it just washes over you. To be in the presence of this child is to be in the presence of God. It comes as it comes. It flashes forth. The quiet hour at day's end, sitting next to the bed of a dying loved one, it grants itself to us like this. Sometimes these tastes or these quickenings are very intense, like a heightened sense of presence. So most of the time, they're extremely delicate, very, very delicate. If you weren't careful, you might have missed it. But the point is that for a fleeting instant, you're a momentary mystic. Because it's a moment in which you and God mutually disappear as dualistically other than each other. See, that's the stunning thing about it, I think. This is what I think when Jesus meant when he said, I came that you might have life and have it more abundantly. It's the life that is at once God's and our own, intimately realized within our own awakened heart. Now, I think really that all of us have moments like this, that from time to time, there's been this quickening, there's been this taste. And the next question is what happens next? Because they tend to be fleeting. Sometimes what happens next is nothing happens next. You look at your wristwatch, your cell phone goes off, and you just move, like the gate of heaven opens, and you walk right past it. But sometimes what happens is that the light that fleetingly shines out from these moments hallows every moment of daily life. You get the intuition that in these moments of awakening, it isn't more was given, but you fleetingly glimpse what every moment deep down really is. And what happens for some people is they long to abide in the depths so fleetingly glimpsed. In my most childlike hour, in my most childlike hour, in a moment of deep suffering, in the pause between two lines of a poem, giving myself in service to the community, there was given to me a taste of a oneness, which having tasted it, I know my life will be forever incomplete without it. I know that in my heart. And I think this is what also brings people to the retreats. It's a longing we don't understand for a union we don't understand, but we know it's real because we experienced it. I will not break faith with my awakened heart. I will not play the cynic. And that's the path. This is path talk. Where can I find someone well seasoned in such things so that in their presence I might find a way to stabilize in this desire? And when such a person discovers the writings of the mystics, St. John of the Cross or Teresa of Avila or Francis or St. Clare, the author of The Cloud of Unknowing, Julian of Norwich, Thomas Merton, when you read them, you can tell they're talking about what your heart longs for. And they bear witness that your heart has not deceived you. It is possible to learn to live in a daily, abiding, underlying constancy of the God-given, godly nature of every breath and heartbeat. It's possible. And so this then really is this a path talk of the way. So I know that if I wait for it to happen, it'll never happen. So I have to commit myself to a daily rendezvous with God in which there's no agenda but love. Like, here I am, Lord. Here I am, Lord. And we give ourselves over to this union that we might be graced with ever deeper awareness of this God's oneness, which is life itself. We know that God's mysterious presence is completely given, and our standing up each time we stand up is completely given each time we sit down. It's completely given in our every breath. It's completely given in the palms of our hands. We know it's true because we tasted it, the holiness of everything. And we know that all of our sorrow is we tend not to taste it. Jesus said, you have eyes to see, but you don't see. Lord, Lord, that I might see, that's our prayer, Lord, that I might see. Lord, that I might see through my own awakened eyes what you saw and all that you saw, because then I'd see God pouring herself out, giving herself to me, whole and complete, just as I am, in this and in every moment of my life. I long for this. Thomas Merton once said, there's a lot of Catholics leaving the church, and the church is not bearing witness to this. It's not bearing witness to the mind of Christ, the Christ consciousness, in the intimacy of our heart like this. And what this does also, another layer of this, is it bears witness to an insight into what it means to be a person. And one way to put it is this, that when God created you as God's beloved, that God created you as someone to whom God could completely give the infinity of himself away, completely. as the mystery of who you are in your nothingness without God. That's the thing. Next, God, unlike stones and trees and stars, all that's true for stones and trees and stars too, but it's true for you as a person. You've been endowed with God with the gift to realize that, to taste the oneness for yourself. Secondly, because love is never imposed but always offered. God quickened you with the awareness of God completely being given away, whole and complete, God's kinetic self-emptying in love, God's ecstasy, which is you. So that you, in realizing this, see, Thomas Merton once said, in the spiritual world, to understand means that you're infinitely understood. To see is to see that you're infinitely seen. To love is that you're infinitely loved. If we think of God as generosity, that you are the generosity of God. Like this. Why? So that you in freedom, since love is never imposed but always offered, that you might then in turn give yourself to God, who is completely being given to you. For in freely giving yourself to God in love, who is being given to you in love, your destiny is fulfilled, because in the reciprocity of love is destiny. This is a foretaste of eternal life. We're going to be spending all of eternity doing this in the fullness of glory. But now we do it as in a mirror darkly. And now we do it as an obscure certainty in our heart. Gabriel Marcel says, as a primitive inner assurance. See, but love and love alone is the deathless mystery that pervades all things. Everything else is what? Like this. So here then, I think then is the first taste, what I would call mystical nonviolence. The first taste of mystical nonviolence is that we not do violence to the infinity of ourself. That we not do violence to the God-given, godly nature of life itself. That I not go around acting as if I'm nothing but the self things happen to. See, the idolatry of conditioned states, the closed horizon of what my eyes can see and my hands can touch and my mind can grasp. Because I do that, I mean, it's violent against the infinity and the divinity of every breath and heartbeat. Unexplainably so, unexplainably so, like this. So we say, wow, this is really something. You know, we sense the poetic. I think when we hear talk like this, we sense that it's beautiful. And our heart knows it's beautiful because our heart knows it's true. But when we try to grasp it as a way to hold on to it, it's elusive. It's elusive. And so we return again to fidelity to a daily practice, to a fidelity to a daily quiet time. See, because we cannot make these flashpoints of awareness happen, nor does it lie within our power to stabilize habitually in it. But what we can do, and this is meditation practice, we can freely choose to assume the stance that offers the least resistance to be overtaken one more time by what we cannot attain, which is experiential salvation, the gift of tears. We can't attain it, but it attains us in the deep acceptance of our inability to attain it. Like this. It's a gift given to us. But it's a gift that doesn't impose itself on us. It invites us to open ourselves to it, to be with childlike sincerity in the daily rendezvous. And then at the ending of each prayer time, to ask God for the grace not to break the thread of this awareness as I go through my day, so that it might become ever more habitual over time. You know, in the Gospels, they ask Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? That is to say, you know, out of all these beautiful things that you say about God and about life and all this, what is it that if we could ground ourselves in that, everything you say would fall into place. And Jesus didn't respond with a doctrine. He didn't respond with something we're supposed to believe. Jesus says the greatest commandment is to love God. Not just to love God, but to love God with all your heart is the greatest commandment. And to love God with all your soul and with all your strength, like this. That's the greatest commandment. And so then we sit with God and we say, yes, I know, but I don't know what all my heart is. I don't. And so I'm asking you to help me with this, that I might know that all my heart is your own heart given to me, whole and complete, forever and ever. Amen. And that my soul, that is the very subjectivity of myself, the essence of who I am, is the infinite subjectivity of you being given to me as the intimacy of my very subjectivity, each unto each, like this. And with all my strength. But all my strength isn't my strength alone, which is finite. All my strength is your strength given to me in empowering me to achieve through your power what I empowered us to achieve. Help me with this, Lord, please. Thomas Merton once said, with God, a little sincerity goes a long, long way. He said, when we sit in prayer, we begin by just accepting that we belong to God, that we're already in the midst of God. Nothing's missing anywhere, really. And this is our practice. Now, there's a catch in all this, is our wayward ways. That is, we're exiled from the generosity of God pouring itself out as life itself. We're estranged from it. We know it's true, but we're estranged from it. This is the meaning of original sin, not as a blight against the soul. It doesn't mean that at all. But rather we're exiled from the divinity of every breath and heartbeat. Because to taste the divinity of every breath and heartbeat, fear has no foundations in it. Fear has no foundations in it. And Jesus says, not as the world, peace I give you, peace I give unto you. Not as the world gives do I give unto you. Because what kind of peace does the world give? The world gives a peace that's dependent on conditions conducive to peace. If I'm in conditions conducive to peace, if my physical health, my family, my possessions, my neighborhood, then I can be at peace in conditions conducive to peace. But since it doesn't lie in my power to maintain conditions conducive to peace, and if I momentarily am able to, there are millions and millions and millions of my brothers and sisters all over the world who are not living in conditions conducive to peace. Therefore, how can I learn, Lord? How can I learn to be free from the tyranny of fear in the midst of my fears? How can I learn to be free from the tyranny of my brokenness in the midst of my brokenness? For you so loved the world, God. You so loved the world, you sent your only begotten Son. You didn't love the world waiting for it to measure up to what it was supposed to be, but you came and walked the world as it is in all of its brokenness. And that's us. That's us. How can I learn to give up the idolatry of my worth? As measured, am I holy enough yet? Am I holy enough yet? Am I holy enough yet? How can I learn to give that up? To know in the very midst of my brokenness and my wayward ways and my half-heartedness, I put my faith in you being infinitely in love with me in the midst of my brokenness. And you carry me in my brokenness and sustain me in my brokenness unexplainably, like this. So I would say this then, that there's that in us that knows this. That as we can resonate with the beauty of it, we're no strangers to this. And there's that in us that doesn't know it yet. That in us that knows it is that which is awakened and encouraged and consoled by the truth of such things. That doesn't know it yet is the us that still gets reactive, still gets overwhelmed, still is grounded in a peace that's determined on the outcome of my efforts. Thomas Merton once said, those committed to peace must be very careful not to be invested to the outcome of their efforts, because by human standards it might go down in flames, which is the mystery of the cross. They asked the Dalai Lama once, they said, China isn't going to let go of its hold on Tibet. Why do you do this? Why do you keep proclaiming this? And the Dalai Lama said, because it's the truth. And so what I'm doing then always, it's not a linear path to God, my awakened self. And then there's part of me that doesn't get it yet, that's reactive, judgmental, afraid, withholding, all these things. You have your litany of your brokenness, I have mine. But we're always circling back around to be there for and with that in us that needs to be loved the most. The part that's still afraid, that's still confused, to be tender-hearted toward the broken places. And know that when you do that, your tender-heartedness toward the broken places incarnates God's infinite tender-heartedness towards you, which is Jesus. And you walk your walk, an infinitely loved broken person, forever and ever. Like this. You know, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in The Stages of Dying, she in her research work, she found that people dying, they tend to go through stages. You know, first there's denial. You can't believe it, your turn's finally come. And then there's bargaining. You try to make a deal with God. See, if you let me live, and you realize that God doesn't accept the offer. You're still dying. And then you get angry. And then you go into depression. And all that is the ego self coming to the end of itself, clinging to itself. She said, but beyond that, there's acceptance. Not everybody comes to acceptance. My wife died 2 years ago, right here in the living room from Alzheimer's. My oldest daughter is an in-house nurse. And I was sitting next to her holding her hand while she died, like this. And she died with acceptance. And you get this feeling when you look into the face of the dying loved one, you're looking into the gate of heaven. Because it's freedom from the tyranny of death in the midst of death. See, it's an immense mystery for us of far-reaching implications like this. Because we're all dying. Life, how I put it is this: when we're born onto the earthly plane, God exhales us onto the earth in our journey through time. And we're here for a very short time, really, basically to learn how to love. And then in God's good time, God inhales, and we return back to the love from which we came, you know, as our homecoming. So that the passage of time on earth, this is a temporary arrangement. We're all sitting here melting like candles. Very, very soon now, none of us will be here. But forever and ever and ever and ever, we'll all be in God forever. See? Because of this deathless nature of the self poured forth from God like this. Our true self, as Merton would say. And so really, then we might say then this work of mercy towards, when I'm talking about others, this is still with ourselves. When we become aware of our own suffering, that when love comes in contact with suffering, the suffering turns love into mercy. And we have mercy on ourselves. And our mercy on ourselves is an echo. I have to keep this. My daughters call me each day because I have to keep it on. They worry about me that I'm going to fall. So they call me. Just sorry about that. To be sure they don't want me to fall over. And so anyways, it's good. So this is what I've learned then. from the people on the retreats seeking this way like this. And the second source I'd like to say is what I've learned from people in psychotherapy. And what's interesting, what I would do really, when I got my doctorate, I was giving retreats. Every other weekend, I'd give a silent retreat somewhere and locally. Then Monday through Thursday, my wife and I would see people in psychotherapy. We saw mainly adult survivors of trauma who wanted their spirituality to be a resource in their therapy. What's interesting, these people on retreats and these people on therapy were often the same people. People on the retreats would come to me and ask to come for therapy, and the people would come to me for therapy and start going to the retreats. And I was one of them, because I was a spiritually awakened, traumatized person, a severe post-traumatic stress disorder, my own healing journey. And so it's what I learned then, sitting with trauma, the reality of trauma, the intimacy of it, the savagery of trauma. And what is trauma? The root of the word trauma is a wound or a source of suffering, really. And it's exposure to any overwhelming event. And if it reaches white hot intensity in the trauma, you disappear into the trauma. It's a kind of a psychic death, really. And if you survive, you're so grateful you made it after the rape or the beating or in war to our Vietnam vets, people, whatever trauma. You realize the traumatizing event is over, but the trauma is soaked into you and it lives on inside of you, and you're a traumatized person. And there's shame around that. There's powerlessness around it. And the truth is this, what I love about therapy, really, the spirituality of therapy, that when we risk sharing what hurts the most in the presence of someone who will not invade us or abandon us, we can learn not to invade or abandon ourselves. We can be reparented in love and be there for and with the hurting part and walk, feeling what we need to feel, grieving what we need to feel, walking through the process like this. But something even deeper happens in therapy. In the midst of trauma, one can come upon within oneself what Jesus called the pearl of great price. You can come upon Merton says, it is that in us that is not subject to the brutalities of our own will, because it belongs completely to God. No matter how badly you've trashed yourself by ritualistically reenacting the way you've been treated, this is that in you that belongs completely untouched, unthreatened, and unhindered, because it belongs to God. And no matter what anybody did to you, it cannot touch this. And no matter how badly what they did to you became internalized with feelings of self-loathing, self-cutting, self-medicating with alcohol, ritualistically acting out, whatever the survival pattern is that was formed in trauma and abandonment, this remains untouched, belongs completely to God. And in the very midst of the deep acceptance of the brokenness, the light shines out. And I think this is really at the heart of the miracles of Jesus in the gospel. You look at them, but there's a pattern. They're all kind of the same in a way. Jesus spent whole nights in prayer, in this union with God that was his very identity. He who sees me sees the Father. And he came out into daylight in the morning, and he walked the earth, looking to set people free from suffering. When the word got out, the suffering came looking for him. My daughter died. I can't see. I can't walk. I have leprosy. I'm a prostitute, whatever. And what's really interesting in these miracle stories, when you look at them, Jesus meets them in their suffering and responds in an extraordinary, miraculous way. The lame walk, the blind see. But then it says, he said, this is an outward sign of the true miracle. And so what is the true miracle? Jesus saw that the root of their suffering was not that they couldn't walk or they couldn't see. It wasn't that their daughter died or they had leprosy. That's life. Life's a precarious, fragile, fleeting place. A beautiful, God-filled, fleeting, brutal place. Always will be. The root issue is they thought they were what was wrong with them. They thought their internalized trauma, the internalized sin, see, had the authority to name who they are. This is a story, the good thief on the cross. See, well, remember me when you come into your kingdom. See, and Jesus said, well, let me check this out. I have to go down the list first. I don't know if you're going to pass muster here. See, you're already in. See, and the person, in the actual act of dying, liberates the person. The sovereignty of love in the crucifixion of love that permeates the whole world. Love crucified. We all share it. So here's how I put it poetically. The person being healed approaches Jesus, say a person with leprosy, or a prostitute, whoever it is. But here's the poetry of it. They stand there, they're looking at each other. And interior, just between them, Jesus said, I know you. From all eternity, Abba, God the Father, contemplated you in me, hidden with Christ in God forever before the origins of the universe. This is the you that was never, never, never born, because God has never, never, never not known who you are and are called to be. And the you that was never born is you that will never die, because God will never, 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 never not know who you are in God. And since everything in God is God, this is the divinity of you. I know you. And reflected in his eyes, they see their true face, and that's salvation. They walked home free. They walked home free. Free at last, God Almighty, free at last. I sang in my chains like the sea, the poet Dylan Thomas says. Free of the tyranny of suffering in the midst of suffering, free from the tyranny of death in the midst of death. Because here's the thing about God's love for us. God's love for us utterly transcends and utterly permeates the brokenness of this world, but God doesn't take it away. See, if you're otherwise come down from the cross, he didn't come down. You know why? He was nailed to it. That's why he couldn't. Like this. And that's why I say, really, there's another deep meaning of mystical nonviolence. Say, God is a presence that spares us from nothing, even as God unexplainably sustains us in all things. God depends on us to protect ourselves and each other, to be a nurturing, loving, protective person. And when suffering is there, God depends on us to reach out and touch the suffering with love that it might dissolve in love. But here's the thing. To be present, to touch the suffering with love that it might dissolve in love, grounded in a peace is not dependent on the outcome of the effort. Because regardless how it turns out, God is unexplainably taking us to ourselves, breath by breath, moment by moment, unexplainably. That's mystical nonviolence. It's not the nonviolence that protects our biological existence. It doesn't dismiss it either, because it's a mystery of incarnate infinity intimately realized. It is the holiness of the body, of the mind, of the body. We must do it. But that's not the final word of who we are at all. It's the self that dies is a self that will never die. Nobody dies. Everything is forever and ever. A small child on a merry-go-round. Someone once said, we don't understand human nature until we know why a child on a merry-go-round will wave at his parents every time around, and they always wave back. Death and resurrection, death and resurrection, death and resurrection. Things seem to go away, but in reality, nothing ever goes away. I once asked Dan Walsh in the monastery in medieval philosophy class, I said, could we say that after the geographical Tokyo no longer exists, there'll still be Tokyo? He said, yes, because Tokyo is in God's mind, and God never forgets. When you and I die, we're all going to die soon enough. We're all going to go into this moment forever, because everything is forever. That's the point. This is the Bhagavad Gita. You know, Arjuna, the chariot driver, he's going into battle. It's really the battle of life. And he tells the Lord Krishna, he said, you know, I don't want to do this. These clan members, these are my relatives. I don't want to do this. And Krishna tells him, you know, yes, but see, nobody dies. Nobody dies. And so the whole mystery of nonviolence to me is just at all price. And we all interpret this in different ways according to the lights we've been given, how we live this. And but really that we not do violence to the deathless mystery of ourself that so fleetingly shines out in the beauty of the fragility of our life on this earth, the eternality of the fleetingness of everything, intimately realized. And so for me, this is how I experience mystical sobriety. I experience it within myself. As a trauma survivor, I know violence well, what it did to me. And people, this. And I know it in sitting with people and with this. And so I'll end with a final image, two final images in therapy and mystical nonviolence. I was seeing a woman in therapy, and her parents never abused her, but they would have violent arguments in front of her all the time, like throwing things and screaming at each other. And they were so angry at each other that they didn't realize how terrified she was. She was maybe 6 years old, 5 years old. How invisible she was to them. She said one summer night they were having one of their fights. In her therapy, she told me it was summertime and she opened the screen door in the back patio door and went out into the dark in her yard. She climbed up in the low branches of a tree and she closed one eye and lined up a twig with a star. And she said she told God, if you know I'm here, make that star move to the other side of that twig. She said, it'll be a secret between us. And she says, God didn't move the star. And then she said, but you know, years later, there's something about the remembrance of myself as a little girl sitting alone in the dark in the low branches of a tree, waiting for God to move a star that consoles me. And I said to her, yes, that's true, God didn't move the star, but years later, you were moved by the story and sharing it with me. And I want to tell you, I was moved by it too, because I was touched. See? So let's make a deal. In your therapy, every time you feel stuck, she was working through this trauma. Well, imagine we're sitting together in the low branches of a tree, looking up, waiting for God to move the star. And we'll learn together the issue isn't or not God's going to move the star. The issue is learning not to do violence to the fragility of our waiting. That's the thing. Because God already is the infinity of our waiting. Just like our love for God our longing for God is an echo of God's infinite longing for us. God waits for us with infinite patience and draws us on and on and on. And then out of that patience unexpectedly emerges the taste of what was there all along. But we had to wait until we ripened in the waiting to see it. T.S. Eliot says, to think too soon is to think the wrong thing. To hope too soon is to hope for the wrong thing. Like you're not ready yet. But in the waiting and the humility of the waiting, there are grantings that we learn. And so this is my sense of the interiority of mystical nonviolence. This is my sense of the poetics of it. It's something to ponder, or something, it's not a topic. It isn't like there's something called nonviolence and let's discuss it. And that has its own, just like theology has a place. That has a place. That has a place. But what is the intimate realization of that as lived and as experienced and shared with others as it's given to us to do so? Because we're each walking our own walk here as this is given to us. We're all in this together, all of us. So that's my first attempt to share something about mystical nonviolence. So I'm finished. I'm done.
Wow. Thank you so much, Jim. How about a show of hands from all your listeners? Thank you so much. There's almost 100 people listening to you, Jim.